Lovely. Well, thank you ever so much, Claire, and good evening, sisters. I hope everybody has enjoyed the first Monday of March, wherever you are. Spring definitely feels in the air where I am. And I was told recently that I think the sun's not going to set until about 6ish or until after 6ish from this point, until about October. So, we're letting the light in, which is lovely. Although it was one of my students who told me that, so we might actually want to fact check that, Claire, before we're at risk of spreading fake news. But I hope we've had an enjoyable day, and we're certainly set to have a stimulating evening in discussion with Nan about Labour's history, but particularly Labour women's history over the past 100 years. Now, as Claire said, I'm Kiran. I'm LWN's National Secretary and a history educator. So it is wonderful to share this space with so many sisters for LWN's Women's History Month. I'll be putting some questions to Nan, who I think is an absolute hero and champion of political education in general in our movement, both training the kind of political leaders for the future, but also ensuring that Labour women from the past take their rightful place on the record. The event will be looking at the 1924 Labour government and the role that women played in the movement at that point, but we will be moving on in centuries, so we hope to cover the early 20th century in our discussion this evening. Now, it has been 100 years since Labour first formed government, and 2024 is a bumper election year around the world, and I don't often like when history repeats itself, but I think we're all hoping that perhaps it does for Labour again this year. So we're going to start now, not actually at the 1924 government, because like good historians, we like the context first. So it would be useful, I think, if we think about, so 60% of women, only 60% of women were able to vote from 1918. And it'd be interesting to know what political parties' response was to that, because it's quite a significant change to the electorate, and what we know Labour did in particular to the fact that women were now voting for their representation in Parliament, and obviously to those parties then who would form government.
Thank you very much. First of all, can I say thank you for your very kind words of introduction, and also thank you to everybody who's come this evening. I hope you will enjoy finding out about the women who set the scene for the rest of us in the party a century later. As you rightly say, Kiran, 60% of women got the vote in 1918. The Tory party and the Lib Dems, or the Liberals as they were then, both had existing women's organisations. And so, although they both had other problems, they both had organisational problems, Tories in particular, they did not have to set up entire new structures. The Labour Party, on the other hand, had not been an individual membership organisation until between 1900 and 1918. You were organisations affiliated to it, as they still do, but there was no provision for individual membership. And the new party constitution that came in after the end of the First World War introduced individual membership for both women and men, but women's membership was lower than men's, and they had fewer rights within the party, which will not astound you. The rationale for this was that women were new to politics and would not, they would need to be educated and developed and have their confidence built. Stop me if you're still hearing this a century later. And so there was a view that they weren't quite ready for political activism. And the odd, if not actually bizarre thing about this was that the primary target for recruitment were the suffragists, who in 1912 had done an electoral pact with Labour and had trained all the Labour election organisers, because the National Union of Women's Socialist and Suffrage Societies, Freudian slip, suffrage societies had enormous experience of by-election organisation. There was a by-election every other month in those days, because if you were appointed to government office, you had to resign and be re-elected by your constituents so that they approved of you going into office. And not quite sure what this whiteboard is. The Labour Party therefore absorbed what had been an independent Labour women's organisation, the Women's Labour League, that formed the core of the women's structure. They set up women's sections in every constituency. They had a national woman, not women's, but national woman officer, who was called Marion Phillips, who was a brilliant organiser. There was a regional woman organiser in every region. So there was one male organiser and one female organiser in each region. Sometimes they got on, sometimes they didn't. And the primary objective was to recruit as many women as possible. And they were so successful that throughout the 1920s and well into the 1930s, women outnumbered men as members of the party. They didn't have equal access to power in the party, but as members, they outnumbered men, sometimes by quite a significant degree. And that's because most men chose to continue to exercise their party membership through the trade union structures, whereas women didn't have that access, and so found individual members and membership and women's sections the best way to go. Some former suffrage campaigners refused to join the party altogether because of the lesser level of membership, on the grounds that they thought they were being corralled into making tea and baking cakes and running jumble sales, and they didn't much fancy it.
On that, I was going to one of my follow-ups was, I think if people are hearing, you said that women at the start of their involvement in the party were given a lower status of membership. Could you tell us a bit more about what that meant in terms of what couldn't they do that men could? What has helped us understand that it was a two-tier membership system?
They had less access to voting rights in the party, but mainly it was just about an assumption that they would not be playing a full part in the party's life. And so, although, for instance, there were reserved places for women on the NEC, an agreement which still stands, those women were not elected then as now. Possibly not as now, but certainly then by women in the party. They were elected by all party members, and there was a great resistance to there being anything specifically women orientated. And so the chance, for instance, to get women's issues onto the table was not equal to that of men, because men had control of most constituency structures, and men certainly had control of what came through affiliated organisations, which were exclusively male. There was no, after the Women's Labour League was absorbed, there was no independent Labour women's organisation until LWN affiliated about a decade ago.
That's helpful. So there's an element there, I suppose, of a disparity or unequal power when it comes to both voting rights that women had, but also their ability to voice any concerns that they might want raising or might want discussing that for the
Yeah.
movement to consider. So I suppose it shouldn't really be an ironical position, but you can kind of see it as the campaign to win the vote, as in the vote, has been achieved, but then within our own party structures there's a continuation of inequality when it comes to women's power and agency within the party in that stage of kind of early formation of the party. You talked about I thought it was quite interesting as well that even though women were thought that this had to happen because women needed, like you said, the training and the education to be able to handle such big issues, that it was, you mentioned the suffragists who ended up actually delivering a lot of the training, which I assume would have been to men at the time within the movement in terms of how to organise and how to get the vote, and then ultimately how to get the electorate to vote Labour so we could see the first government. Was my understanding correct there in terms of
Yes,
in
when they did the Electoral Pact in 1912, there is a letter from one of the women who went in to help the party organise its ground operation, what we would now call its ground operation, who wrote to Millicent Fawcett and basically just said, these people know nothing. They have no idea how to organise a committee room. They have no idea how to canvass. They have no idea of how to run an election campaign, and we're going to have to start at the beginning with them. So you can see that when 6 years later they're being told they're not quite ready for politics, some of them were pretty miffed. Is a technical phrase for
yeah. Sure, and certainly they're elevating their position to more than tea maker and cake baker, in terms of actually ensuring a grand campaign and turning the vote then into what we see to be a positive vote for Labour in the 1924 election. So why don't we talk about that then? What happened in 1924?
Well, the 1924 government was the result of an election held right at the end of 1923, which had resulted in a hung parliament, in which there was no clear winner. So there had been since there had been an election in 1918, an election in 1922, and an election in 1923. So people were pretty fed up of elections and really wanted somebody to get a grip and get on with things. And the political parties had different views of what should happen. The Liberals thought that if they put Labour in, Labour would make a mess of government, and then people would realise that the Liberals were really wonderful, and the Labour vote would collapse, and the Liberal Party would return to its. And at that point, they were still a viable government, and they hadn't actually collapsed by that point. Stanley Baldwin for the Tories thought that if he allowed the Liberals to put Labour in, that the other thing would happen, which is that Labour would make a reasonable fist of it, but wouldn't be able to last very long. Because the Tory vote in 1923 had been quite poor, he recognised that he needed to reorganise the Tory party's ground operation in order to be able to deliver what was then modern campaigns, that they were behind with that. So he needed a breathing space to do that. And he thought that a Labour government wouldn't actually be catastrophic, but and therefore would probably finish off the Liberals.
Mm.
And Labour thought that if we had a period of time in government we would be able to demonstrate that we were a responsible set of people and were capable of running a government, and therefore would have a chance of winning the next election, which everybody knew would be in a matter of months, a year at the outside, that then we would come back with a working majority at what would then be the fourth election in 6 years. So
all the political bigwigs at the time never thought it would happen, and made
well, they
political leaders of the other parties essentially downplayed, took a gamble with what would happen, and kind of got it wrong. Is that?
well, no, Baldwin got it absolutely right. Baldwin got it spot on, because in the 1924 general election, that's the point at which the Liberal vote absolutely crashed and burned, and has never recovered from that point. So that was the calculation that he made would be the consequence of a Labour government. We could have won that 1924 election had it not been for the Zinoviev letter and one or two other things around suspicion about our relationship with the Communist Party and our relationship with Russia, plus the fact that Baldwin did use that breathing space to reorganise his ground operation. And so the 1924 election was effectively a Tory landslide.
Okay, so in 1924, Labour was given a chance.
Yep.
Short-lived.
9 months, yes.
9 months, but let's take a win as a win, at that point, and say it was a big moment, I suppose, for our movement at this point. Never had we had, I suppose, an electorate that was as democratic as it was, and then placing their trust in Labour to form government. Now, it was short-lived. It was it was a government for 9 months, and it's an interesting, I suppose, fairly turbulent time in the 20s that's taking place. But what was it a big year for Labour women at all? What do we know about 1924 and women's involvement in elected positions at that point?
The 1923 general election, the December 1923 general election, produced 3 Labour women MPs, first 3 Labour women MPs, Dorothy Jewson, Susan Lawrence and Margaret Bonfield. They all came through the trade union route. And Dorothy Jewson was a teacher. Susan Lawrence was what we would now describe as the GMB, and so was Margaret Bonfield. Margaret Bonfield was the most senior trade unionist in the country, not just the most senior female trade unionist in the country, but the most senior, because she was chair of the TUC, which was the key job at that time rather than general secretary. And she was very well known across the country. It has still taken her 3 goes to get into Parliament, because you may be a very senior trade unionist, but we're not going to give you a safe seat.
Nevertheless, she persisted.
And nevertheless, she persisted, and at the 3rd attempt got in as the MP for Northampton. And then, so that's in December 1923.
Yeah.
Then they had to form a government. Ramsay MacDonald, who was the Prime Minister, the incoming Prime Minister, who had known Margaret Bonfield for a long time, was very clear that he wanted at least one of the women to be in a government role. And she was the obvious person, because not only had they known one another a long time, but she was also very senior in the trade union movement, was extremely well networked both nationally and internationally, and had an exhaustive knowledge of the benefits, what we would now call the benefits system, which then came under the Ministry of Labour. as it was then, because most of the benefits were connected to employment in one way or another. And so she, in January, became when she'd been an MP for about 5 weeks, with Christmas intervening, then became a junior minister in January 1924. And she was not the only person she was the only woman to have a payroll, what we would now think of as a payroll position. But she wasn't the only minister who was coming in with very little knowledge of Parliament. But she did say it was a real struggle trying to get your head round how Parliament works at the same time as trying to get your head round how government works. And anybody who has been elected to Parliament will tell you it takes quite a while to work your way in. It was slightly less complicated for the women because there were very few women MPs, about 8 of them in total.
In total, not just Labour, in total in the House.
There were they had to share a room, so they didn't have an office each. They just bunged all the women in one room and shut the door, basically. People complained that there were no mirrors. Ellen Wilkinson, when she got there the following year, complained because there was no iron. There were no bathing facilities or showers for them. There were all of these things for the men, obviously. In the case of the iron, with women to do the actual ironing. And so there was constant run of complaints about not having enough space to work in, not having enough space. And people used to go in and find one another asleep on the one sofa that there was in there. It was just terrible, really. So there was all that. And then on top of that, there was all the parliamentary procedure, all the stuff to get your head round. And then for Margaret Bonfield, on top of that, government to get your head round. So it was pretty full on. Some of the parliamentary procedure bore no relation, but was completely out of sync with having women involved. One of the things that the Labour women refused to do was wear hats in the chamber, because the wearing of a hat indicated acceptance of subservience. And so although they wore hats outside the chamber, as soon as they got to the door of the chamber, they all removed their hats and went into the chamber bareheaded. And obviously there was a press row about that, but especially when some of the Tory women started to do the same.
Can we just stay on the hats point for a moment?
Yes, I'm staying on the hats point because
so that I fully understand it. I think this is an anecdote I want to be able to retell at some point. So I want to tell it with fully knowing what it is. So, was there a rule that women had to wear hats in Parliament?
No, there was an intense social convention.
Yeah.
That women wore hats all the time.
As a symbol of subservience.
Yes, and in particular in places of worship or in formal settings. And the remnant of that is everybody wearing a hat at weddings, for instance, which there's no real reason for, but it's just a sort of hangover from the days when women wore hats to all formal occasions.
Yes.
The Chamber of the House of Commons is a reconstruction of St. Stephen's Chapel in the old Westminster Palace, which burned down. So I know there's all this nonsense about 2 sword lengths and all the rest of it. It's actually because it is the choir of a chapel. And therefore, and it's a formal occasion. And therefore, as a matter of respect, women were expected to wear hats. And removing their hats in a very obvious way at the door of the chamber was a very definite demonstration of we are inferior to nobody. When in 1929, Margaret Bonfield became the first female cabinet minister and was sworn in as a Privy Councillor, she also refused to wear a hat to be sworn in as a Privy Councillor. And the palace apparently had no idea what to do about this because they'd never had to swear a woman in as a Privy Councillor before. And they've written to her and said, could you wear a dark suit and a white shirt and a hat? And she wrote back and said, white suit, white shirt, dark suit, no problem. Hat, no. And in the end, she won on that one as well. So it's an interesting thing that now does not have the meaning that it had in the 20s. But in the 20s, Nancy Astor, who was the first woman to take her seat in Parliament, was horrified. Susan, one of the conventions in Parliament was that if you want to raise a point of order during a vote, you had to wear a hat, and there was a top hat kept in Parliament for this particular purpose.
All members in that moment, men
all
and women.
members, men and women.
Yeah.
And of course, the women refused to do this, and therefore they couldn't raise points of order. So Susan Lawrence took to raising point of order with the order paper balanced on her head, at which point the speaker went, oh, for goodness sake, women do not need to wear a hat to raise a point of order. And the requirement for men to wear a hat to raise a point of order was not abolished until the mid-1990s. So it's one of the very few things where women got there first.
Look, again, we'll take that. Okay, people might not think
Exactly.
it was of fundamental importance to women's power, but you know, they worked hard for their rights.
And it was then. It was then.
Absolutely. And I think it just also speaks to the ridiculousness of having to learn the conventions of a place, and then also have to put up with the ridiculousness that comes with clearly quite sexist sexist culture, and the fact that women had to show their subservience even once they had entered the House of Commons. So thanks for explaining the hat situation. Quite like the idea that up until the mid-90s, did you say that men still had to wear top hats?
Yeah, to raise a point of order during a vote.
During a vote, yeah, limited situation, but you still had to have your top hat handy.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, let's go back to let's move away from hats. Back to perhaps some policy issues that women were interested in at this time. So we've got an understanding now that Labour, there were 3 Labour women elected in the 1923 election. Margaret Bonfield is the woman who becomes a minister in the 1924 Labour government. You know, a woman of huge experience, talent, respect across the movement. Do we know about any policy issues that we would say perhaps like party members would be interested in? Do we know much about the relationship between the women's section and the party at this stage?
I think running battle sort of covers the relationship. A women's conference had been set up at the same time after the First World War. I saw a thing a few years ago when women's conference started again recently, of people saying the first ever delegate women's conference, and I thought, hang on a minute, what happened to the 80 years for which there was a delegate women's conference? And women's conference had precisely the problem that women's conference always has, which is it can't get policy through, because when policies go to the floor of annual conference, it certainly in those days, they were likely to get voted down by the block vote of the unions. And so there were a lot of problems between the women's conference and the women's sections, who had a very clear view about the sorts of issues that they thought the party should be taking on, and the party which had different views. And I'll just give you 2 examples. One is housing, which was the big issue after the First World War and all the Homes Fit for Heroes stuff, and the big drive to build houses, women in the party thought, not unreasonably, that since the majority of women spent their working lives in houses, that women should have some say on how the houses were designed. And that they had very strong views, for instance, on how kitchens should be built and how they should be designed. They had very strong views on stairs, again, unsurprisingly, and how space should be distributed and used. And the Fabian women produced a whole study about women and housing. Most women were very interested and involved in it. And when the Labour government came in, they tried to meet the Minister of Housing to explain to him why this was important, and he was basically not interested. And so there was then a continuous to and fro between, before you actually spend this money, could we just tell you what we need? And him going, we know what we need to do it quickly, we don't have time for messing about. And you can imagine the view that there was. So that ran all the way through, and is connected to the whole benefits issue that also ran all the way through, about who should be in receipt of various benefits, how should they be paid to whom, what constituted genuinely seeking work, what did that actually mean, what should happen with married women who were assumed to be dependent on their husbands, all of that issue. And in a way they're not connected, but in a way they are connected, because they are about how families in an era of rising unemployment and very poor housing provision, how we were to get out of that. So that was one whole area in which both men and women were interested, but which women wanted to change the way in which both the housing system and the benefit system were designed. The other big area of disagreement was birth control, which
area of disagreement with the Labour government, or with the Labour
Well, with the Labour, it never got as far as the Labour government, but with the Labour Party, the view of women was that access to birth control, particularly for married women, would reduce both maternal and infant mortality. So it wasn't an argument at that stage about women's bodily autonomy. It was about infant and maternal mortality, both of which were very high. And there was a strong view that giving women the ability to reduce the size of their families and improving the conditions in which they lived would lead to fewer children dying and fewer women dying in childbirth. Unfortunately, depending on your point of view, but the Minister for Housing, who was also the Minister for Health, because housing at that time was considered to be a health issue.
That is interesting.
Was a Glaswegian Catholic, and he was absolutely unshakably opposed to birth control in any form. And equally, that would not have mattered in itself had it not been politically necessary to keep the Glaswegian and most of the Scottish MPs, but particularly the Glaswegian MPs on side, because what MacDonald particularly didn't want to do was to have party splits, and they were not entirely happy about going into government anyway. So there was a problem that they couldn't get it past him. That might not have blown up into a major row, but the party then tried to prevent Women's Conference from discussing it at all.
Imagine that went down well.
From discussing birth control or abortion at all. And there were massive rows at Women's Conference about this, because the National Women Officer obviously had to implement this decision that had been taken with or without her agreement. And so there were huge rows about it, which the three women MPs obviously got caught in the middle of. So it, the whole theme of the party dealing not particularly effectively with issues that are of fundamental importance to women goes back a long way, because they could have sorted that out in the 1929 Labour government, when Susan Lawrence became effectively the junior, the PPS to Arthur Greenwood, who then became the Minister of Health. Local authorities were then allowed to offer contraceptive advice to married women if they chose to do so, and many authorities did. So they got there in the end, at least to the point of opening it up as something which was not irredeemably immoral to do. But
it seemed to have needed an internal row to allow that to happen.
yes, I mean, in the case of John Wheatley, who was the Health and Housing Minister, when you read accounts of that Labour government, he gets a lot of the credit, and entirely deservedly gets a lot of the credit for the government's housing policy and the housing provision that came in. But the other side of it, the whole issue with how women got their voices heard in both of those areas, is the bit that doesn't get into the mainstream histories of the party or of that government.
So who was there influencing the ultimate decision? And there's you've told that story of actually how over time there was a subsection of the party, the women's section, and women wouldn't have been united on this issue, of course, but
No,
we can say it was high on the agenda of topics that women were wanting to discuss within the party, ultimately influencing the decision that was then enacted by somebody who was then thanked by the record, and looking back at those Labour governments of the 20s. Right, I'm going to open the floor to questions in the chat in a moment, but I just thought we've kind of gone through the 20s. It probably would make sense for us to just end on what happened in the 20s, because 1929 was a pretty turning point year globally, with the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. What's the turning point moments for Labour in 1929?
Well, in 1924, Labour lost the general election that finished that first government, and we then had 5 years of a Tory government with a significant working majority. In 1929, in 1928, the 40% of women who hadn't been enfranchised in 1918 finally got the vote. We finally got to universal suffrage, or at least equal suffrage, and that was partly responsible for Labour being the largest party after the 1929, and not solely responsible, but partially responsible. There were still all the concerns about Labour being too left-wing and too close to the Communist Party and all of that. So Labour then decided to go it alone without it not being in coalition with anybody else, because the Liberals by then were done, basically. There were 9 Labour women elected in 1929, including Margaret Bonfield and Susan Lawrence. Dorothy Jewson didn't come back after losing in 1924. And also with Ellen Wilkinson, Jenny Lee, who was the youngest MP at that point. She was 26 when she was elected. Various interesting women. Also, the oldest woman, who was 69, got elected. And also including Lady Cynthia Mosley, whose husband was also a Labour MP at that point. So they were an interesting group of women. Margaret Bonfield became the first female cabinet minister. Typically, Ramsay MacDonald rang her up and said, "Would you come into the cabinet?" And she said, "Oh, there's been lots of really good women elected. Are you sure I'm the right one?"
He's called you. Yeah.
Yes. She became Minister of Labour in the cabinet, but unfortunately they got hit by the Wall Street crash almost immediately. And none of them, to be honest, really knew what to do in the face of it. And it was an unprecedented situation. It was, governments around the world were at a loss as to how to deal with this really first modern economic crisis. And so there were big arguments within the government and within the party that we would now see as austerity, not austerity, cut benefits, not cut benefits. In the middle of which Margaret Bonfield was, obviously. And in 1931, the situation was so bad that there was a demand from the public for a national government, which Ramsay MacDonald, who was then the Prime Minister, thought should happen, and which the rest of the party thought should not happen. And the government fell when Ramsay MacDonald and part of the cabinet went into the national government with the Tories. And obviously, Ramsay MacDonald then becomes one of the many people the Labour Party loves to hate without really quite knowing why. And Margaret Bonfield decided, along with the other 8 women, not to go into the national government. And therefore, in the general election which followed in 1931, because the electorate sided with MacDonald and the national government, they all lost their seats. Labour lost 200 of its 250 seats. Most of the front bench lost their seats, and the party became a rump. The party went down to below its 1906 level of it's 1910, level of representation. So it was catastrophic in terms of what happened for the party, but it was also catastrophic for what happened in terms of women MPs, because there were then no Labour women in Parliament at all until Ellen Wilkinson got back in a by-election, and then gradually other women got back. I can't remember the exact number, but it was only a handful of women who got back in 1935 when Labour managed to claw back 100 seats, and probably would have done much better. There were a lot more women selected for seats for the 1940 general election, but of course the 1940 general election never happened, and because of the Second World War. And so the next election was 1945, when 21 Labour women were elected.
Okay. And I think we're going to wrap that up, but I think I want to give another special mention to Margaret Bonfield. We have done an event about the first 3 Labour women who were elected in 1923. And I know that Ali McGovern MP is very keen to ensure that Margaret Bonfield is recognised for being the first Labour, but also the first woman minister and first woman cabinet minister, and that doesn't seem to be recognised anywhere within the parliamentary estate. So the campaign continues to ensure that women get their rightful recognition of the contributions that they have made and continue to make within politics in general, but certainly within our movement. Now, I think a final question, I suppose, was that we've kind of charted through we've looked at women's representation and women's power and agency in the 1920s, and kind of party structures and membership, and women's representation in the House and government. That 1929 moment of, I was going to ask the question, what did that do politically to the 9 women who chose not to go with Ramsay MacDonald's view? And you answered that before I got there, which was it was catastrophic for them, and then I suppose catastrophic for women's representation as a whole within Labour. Now, would it be fair to say that your assessment would be that in order to build back women's representation after that point, it was women themselves doing that, rather than perhaps the party proactively? Was the party seeking to increase women's representation? Would it have been, a combination of those things? What do you think helped increase women's representation from that really low point in early 1930s?
The party did what, until the early 90s, when all women shortlists came in, the party did what it has always done, as I say, until that point, which is to say it wanted more women in public office, but it took almost no steps to make sure that they got there. And at a time when the trade union movement was overwhelmingly male, I mean, the idea that you could have 2 out of 3 of the major unions led by women would have been inconceivable at the time, which does show you Margaret Bonfield's achievement in getting to chair the TUC. It was, and so there was very little actual provision. There was a constant running battle to try and get women into seats where they might have decent majorities. The vast majority of women, again, until the 1990s, and for some time after, were in seats with small majorities, marginal seats, where they're more likely to lose when the tide turns against us. And that's one reason why there's this idea that women never last in politics, in Parliament, and it is largely because women were always in the marginal seats, and so of course they didn't last. I did a study some years ago of what happened to men and women elected for the first time in 1997, because people kept saying to me, but the women are all dropping out, and the dropout rate, as opposed, for whatever reason, either standing down or getting beaten, was identical for both men and women. But the narrative is always that women don't have the staying power, and the fact is we
don't have the structural power.
We do now, because we're now in the position where, for the first time, because of the use of AWS in retirement seats as well as marginal seats, has resulted in a big group of women in the PLP now who have got, even in a bad year, seats they are likely to win. Not obviously, no seat is ever safe and all of that, but if you've got a 12,000 majority, the probability is that you will hang on to that seat in most years. So that has changed, and that is a big change, because it means that women in the PLP now are much better able to think about themselves as rounded politicians in the way that men have been able to, rather than constantly looking over their shoulders at, well, but will I win my seat next time? Will I survive? What is likely to happen? In 1945, there was just there were all the usual things that you get in that. Well, I say usual, the things you get in a post-war situation of people want change, and part of that change is more women. There were a lot of men who were still out of the country. There were Labour knew they would win, but they didn't know how many of the seats they would win, and so there was a sort of filling of marginal seats, a sort of backfilling of marginal seats with women candidates, many of whom then won. There was only one Tory woman elected in 1945 and 21 Labour women. That was a high point, though, it went down after that. It went down to single figures in 1979, I think, and then came back up again to in 1987 to 21. And Barbara Follett, who was one of the founders of LWN, ran into Barbara Castle in a corridor and said to her, "Barbara, it's wonderful, isn't it? We've got 21 Labour women MPs." And Barbara Castle looked at her in the way that Barbara Castle could look at you and said, "My dear, that's what we had in 1945," and swept off down the corridor. And that was the spur which led to LWN being founded, because Barbara Follett thought, well, we need to do something about this. And in 1918, there were huge hopes that women would come into Parliament in large numbers, that it was fixed. The political system was now fixed. It was only a matter of time before all women got the vote, which was true, and that women would come into Parliament and would change Parliament, change the culture, change the environment, change all the things that people knew need to be changed. And in fact, it's taken 100 years, more than 100 years, for the Parliamentary Labour Party to get to the point of being 50% female, which it now is 52% female. So it's been long and slow, and it's only speeded up when the party was proactive. When the party simply said, "We'd like to encourage more women to stand," women said, "Then you'll have to do more than just encourage us."
Absolutely. And I think I feel I know a lot about LWN, but I did not know the tale of the conversation between the two Barbaras that gave life to LWN.
Exactly. The reason we're all here tonight.
No, exactly. Now that's wonderful. And I think a great moment to kind of leave our conversation, as people who've heard me and Nan talk about Labour women's history will know, we could talk for hours, but we've probably got stuff on and it's approaching 9 o'clock, and I've hogged all of Nan's time through my questions. So I just wondered, I've had a look in the chat and I haven't seen any come through during the conversation. So if there are any questions, Claire, would you be happy for people to come off mute to ask the question? Any questions they have? Yeah, of course. Lovely. There are, so please do that, because there's multiple people on the call and I can't see you all on the screen. So if anybody does want to ask a question, please unmute and feel free to.
Otherwise, we can keep talking.
Can I just say, this is a historic first, sisters. Don't be shy. You can ask them anything.
Hi, my name's Dina Bong. So I'll take my camera off. Hi.
Hi.
I'm trying to carry. Sorry, I'm actually writing notes. I'm a bit of a nerd. It's really good history lesson. So thank you, Nan. It's fabulous. I was a bit. There was a bit that I got confused with just before you talked about the two Barbaras, about the numbers of Labour women women that were from the Labour Party that were elected. It was 21 in 1945, is that right?
Yeah.
And then it went down to single figures. And what year was that you said before it started to come up again?
I think, though, I wouldn't want to be... I think it was 1979. I wouldn't be sure about that. It's somewhere around that period.
Is that when the all women shortlist came in? Or was that
no?
80s?
The women shortlist came in the early 90s.
Early 90s, yeah. I was wondering if that coincided with when we had the first black MPs. Was that 19?
That's 1987, isn't it?
87.
Well,
yeah.
Bernie Grant, I think, was earlier than that. Diane Abbott, 1987.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm looking at Claire, but yeah.
Yeah, 87. All right. Thank you very much. I'm not very good at dates, but
That's all right.
Into context. And there's the stuff about the depression years. I'm going to have to do a lot more digging on that, because it doesn't, the national government. I really thought, people disagree with me, that when we had COVID, we should have had a national government, because it felt like sort of like a war-like situation. And I felt that, don't think Labour in opposition with such a Tory majority got a good say at what was going on. And I think that contributed to the chaos, like the parties and the nonsense that went on, kind of thing. But thank you anyway for educating me. Cheers.
Thank you. 11. Thank you, Corinna. It's not 1979 then. I told you not to rely on me for that. My detailed knowledge goes up really to the end of the 30s, and beyond that, I'm not as reliable.
But I think it's an important time that we know more about, and I think there has been an element of not deliberately wanting to perhaps talk about Labour in the 20s and the national government and the Great Betrayal, because it did cause division then, and interpretations of it now wouldn't be perhaps as unifying. So you know, I'm very grateful for your knowledge being in the kind of 90s and 20s space. Julie, your emoji hand is up. Do you have a question?
Apologies.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, Nan. We had Labour group tonight. I'm really sorry I was late in. But I just wondered what reading you can recommend, because I do love history and I think this would be great. And I know you've got your books now, which I'm ordering at the moment.
There are my books.
Yeah. But I just wondered, like, sort of this history of the Labour Party in general, as well as women. What reading you could recommend around that?
There are some good general histories of the Labour Party. They are all written by men. And so there are, if you want a history of women in the Labour Party, that is much harder to find. There is some academic stuff about, but it's academic. It's not. So the sort of history that I write, because I'm not an academic, I try and make accessible and tell the story. And there's relatively little of that about. Yep, there's Rachel's Women of Westminster. There is Ian Dale Bite Back Publishing has a enormous volumes, but libraries, if we still have them, will have them, which is about every female MP.
Honourable Ladies, Volume 1 and 2.
Honourable, I ought to know because I wrote the Nancy Astor bit in it. So I should know, but my memory for these things is not good. And then there are various biographies of women. There are some good biographies of Ellen Wilkinson, which will also give you party background. There are biographies of Barbara Castle, which will give you later background. The early part of there are books coming out now about the 1920s, because we're coming up to a whole series of centenary. So there's the 1924 Labour government. There are two very good books about the 1924 Labour government out. Unfortunately, they are both by men, and they are called The Men of 1924 and The Wild Men of 1924. And in one of them, I can't remember which, Margaret Bonfield gets oh, actually, she was the junior minister, but she was considerably better than her boss, kind of mention, but beyond that, not much. But there will be the general strike centenary coming up. There will be the 1929 Labour government centenary coming up. So we are, over the next few years, going to have a whole flood of books. And one of the things we need to try and make sure is that there is stuff about women in all of those, because otherwise the general strike will just become just a load of blokes on strike, which I know there is a really good story to tell about the general strike, but it always gets told without the women in it. And the 1929 general election and Labour government similarly is just going to be a men's history. So I can't say that there is a right lot. There's for a general history of the Labour Party, there's one by Andrew Thorpe, which I think barely mentions women, but is a good general history of the party. The thing about the party's history is that we have a history, but we also have a mythology. And for most people, the mythology is what drives their perception of previous leaders, of previous events. And that then affects our decision making in the future, and not always in a good way, because what we are using to inform our understanding of who we are and where we've come from isn't always accurate. So every time somebody says the trade unions founded the Labour Party, I want to scream at them, no, they didn't. The trade unions and the Independent Labour Party, which had been in existence since the early 1890s, and the Fabian Society and the forerunner of the Communist Party founded the Labour Party together. Most unions did not affiliate, in some cases not for years. The Engineers Union, which was the main forerunner of what is now Unite, didn't affiliate for a long time because they had to get it through an all-member ballot and the members wouldn't vote for it. Some of the miners' unions didn't affiliate until really very late on because they had Liberal MPs, sponsored Liberal MPs in Parliament, and didn't see why they should change. And it's only when the Liberal Party collapsed that that unions who had representation already through that route then viewed the Labour Party as the alternative. A lot of unions did not like or trust Keir Hardie. So, you know, when the party's view of Keir Hardie is the founding genius of the party, but the contemporary view of him was quite different. But that perception, now it's not to say the unions were not extremely important in the foundation of the Labour Party, they were, and that the unions that were supportive were hugely supportive. So the Shop Workers Union, of which Margaret Bonfield was the Assistant General Secretary, the first woman to hold that level of office in a mixed trade union. Unions like that were very supportive, unions who had something to gain directly from a party, but unions who had less to gain from it until after the row some years after the party's foundation about party funding, which I will not bore you with, but which was a massive row at the time. The relationships are never quite what we think that they are, and it's the same thing with the national government. The story is not quite what we think it is. And so hopefully, as we get through the next few years, the books that come out are going to start to put it right. I don't mean by this that people will suddenly start to love Ramsay MacDonald, but they might have a better understanding of who he was and what he achieved, because no Ramsay MacDonald, no Labour Party.
And I think that's a really important point to end on, which is the purpose why we have these events as well, and we have our political education about our shared past in how our movement formed.
Can I just say one other thing? Because I saw somebody in the chat was saying Margaret Bonfield's autobiography, detailed account of her view of the party 20. Yes. The thing to bear in mind about Margaret Bonfield's autobiography, and I speak as somebody who is currently writing a biography of her, is it is not entirely reliable. Every politician tells their own story, and she tells her story. Lots of it is good, but if you do read it, take it with a great a pinch of salt as you would take any other politician's autobiography, but B, be prepared for some mind-numbingly boring bits. Which if I can't remember who it was who was saying it in the chat. If you've read it, you will know there are bits where you think, why do you think I need to know about this? Which is one of the questions I am asking in the book I am currently writing.
I've got it, but I haven't read it in that sense. I dip into it for different things, and I'm pleased to hear you're saying that you're writing a biography, because I've in January I was down in Somerset in Chard, where I'd been asked to go and talk about Margaret Bonfield, because they're actually working to try and get a statue of her in Chard. And I did say that the one thing that is needed is a proper biography. There is one by Tony Judge, which actually is a dreadfully written book. Could have done with an editor and a proofreader, especially, but also get some inaccuracies in as well. And he tends to take things. I agree with what you say about her biography, but there are some quite interesting views from her about how some of those things came out in government, with the party in government. So, yeah.
And particularly when she's talking about in 1924 that how difficult it was to get any focus into what the government were doing, because they wanted to get everything done at once because they had a short time to go. And I agree about that. There are some other things that are yes, well, we'll see. Historical research is like picking the ends out of tangled threads. And I'm spending my time at the moment pulling the ends of the threads and seeing where they go. And Chard is one of the places they will take me. So,
well, let's go and talk to the museum down there, because they're doing I'll let them know that you're actually doing that, because that means I can drop out from this. But they're doing a 5-year programme. But I wanted some of the things I want to do. I don't want to get caught up with Margaret too much. But they're doing a 5-year programme on her, right up to the centenary of her becoming the cabinet minister. So they would welcome your involvement. It's a guy called Howard Bailey's the main contact there.
Thank you very much. That saves me a bit of work.
Bailey at Chard Museum. Yeah, I'll email in his email address for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and this demonstrates
very useful
the power of the sisterhood. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Sue.
Just to draw us to a close, because we do want to finish in the next couple of minutes. I think the point, Nan, you were making about understanding the power of history and the power of the story that people choose to tell, and the impact that still has in the present. And I suppose then the call to action is that we should be informed of the truest story as we can possibly find about Labour's past and about women's role within every aspect of the party, because the myths hold true, and actually with more sense of who we have been, we will have more confidence in who we are now, and the capacity of women to continue to be a force for a powerhouse for good within the party. And hopefully, if we win the public's trust again with the country later on this year. So thank you all for your time this evening. It's always lovely to spend time together, and for your questions. We're always learning, and I've definitely learnt lots and taken lots from this evening. I'm going to hand back to Claire now, just to do some wrap up comments for us all.
Thank you both so much. I could listen to this all night. As ever, LWN has a couple of bits to plug, and I put some links in the comment there, and we'll highlight them very shortly. But can I just abuse this position as host very briefly to ask Nan one sneaky final question, which is, this week, as with most weeks in politics, we've seen lots of women in public life disproportionately attacked, and in particular, the Daily Mail, funded by Lord Ashcroft, going after Angela Rayner as a working class woman of power in the party very specifically. I know that Bonfield did not have to contend with Twitter, but she probably did have to contend with the early incarnation of the Daily Mail. How much of this kind of classist sexism did those three Labour women MPs at the time have to contend with?
Oh, well, interesting. Susan Lawrence was upper class, very well off, started life as a Tory councillor, got converted to socialism during a cleaners' strike at County Hall in London. And there are lots of stories of Susan Lawrence rolling up to party meetings in a carriage and then going home again in one afterwards, which may be apocryphal, but who knows. So she certainly did not get any of that. She might have been a Labour MP, but she was not out of place in terms of class. The House of Commons was full of people from Susan Lawrence's class. Dorothy Jewson, I know that if you know that through Ronnie's sketch of the, I am upper class, I am middle class, I get a crick in my neck. Dorothy Jewson is the middle class one. She was a teacher from a moderately well-off background, but not spectacularly rich and not poor either. And Margaret Bonfield was the working class one, who had come from quite from semi-rural poverty and had gone through a long life. She was 50 by the time she was elected, so there's a lot to go at before we ever get to Parliament. And she certainly did get and she was very conscious, particularly of the lack of education, because she left school when she was 13 and didn't have a university education, hadn't had private education, and all that sort of thing. She was very, very conscious of that. So she was mainly self-educated. And she also had the manual workers background. There was a lot of stuff that must have been colossally irritating to her around her fairy tale story and Labour's shop girl princess, as she got. This is a woman of 50. Labour's shop girl princess. She got a lot of comment about what she was wearing, disproportionately. So she got a lot of comment about her accent, which is why when you see there's a bit of film from 1929 of her introducing the other women MPs, which is around on YouTube, and she has no trace of a West Country accent, but most of the time she actually did have a West Country accent. As soon as she was put in front of a microphone, she got very self-conscious about how she spoke and about her accent, because she knew that people equated an accent with stupidity. I mean, we've all got over that now, haven't we? Haven't we? And so there was a lot of it about. In Parliament, I don't think there was anywhere near as much as you might have expected. I mean, bizarrely, Nancy Astor thought she was great. And Nancy Astor is, not the sort of woman you would have assumed would accept all, working class people coming into Parliament. But she actually thought Margaret Bonfield was, didn't agree with her, but she thought she was great. And I think that it did make her self-conscious throughout her political career. I think she was much less self-conscious about it beforehand.
Were they friends?
Sorry?
Were they friends, Bonfield and Astor, in the spirit of more in common, or
just so, no. But there was much more working cross-party at that stage because there were so few women MPs, and so there were some things they had to gang up together on to get any hearing at all about, but they tended to be practical practical things rather than ideological or the big policy issues.
I could just dive in all night long. Thank you very much indeed for indulging me speaking in one little further question there. We have spoken this evening about how women's representation in the House on Labour benches went up and then went back and then went up again and then has crept ever so slowly. We are obviously hoping that 2024, as opposed to 1924, is the year in which we leapfrog a little bit further. And therefore, sisters, we need your help. I put this link in the comments, but you will obviously all be aware that Friday is International Women's Day. Some of us fight the patriarchy all year round, but for those who prefer to focus their efforts on a particular calendar event, we have some downloadable resources here to help us celebrate the fact that, largely in part because we're all about claiming our achievements at Labour Women's Network, of the industrious training that LWN has done and some changes to the selection procedures that we fought for, we are on course to increase the percentage of women in the House of Commons under a Labour majority of any configuration, any size of Labour majority. If we get a Labour government, we will have more women in the House of Commons than at any point in history, and it is women like you on the call who are helping make that history. So if you would like us to help celebrate and shout about that achievement and tell the world that a Labour government will mean the most diverse parliament ever, this Friday you can download some graphics here. You can use them to shout out to women that you want to see elected. You can use them to amplify yourself, and you can use them to shout about LWN's achievements as a whole. We would really love to see a big Labour feminist presence amid everything else that happens on International Women's Day would be most welcome. And then I've just switched the events page. Can you all see that? Yeah. So we have coming up a couple of our brilliant quick win workshops led by our marvellous training officer, Sian. One on sharpening and media skills, which we ran a couple of months ago, but was so popular, we had a huge waiting list. So it is back by popular demand. And one which I think is as relevant as anything can be in the current climate, a workshop on political self-care called Channeling Audre Lorde, who, as many of you who've been on LWN training will know, famously said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And we all know that politics can be very grim to be part of. So please do come along and learn some strategies for boosting your resilience and weathering any storms that may be about to hit us. And furthermore, if you happen to be a candidate in the local elections or mayoral elections, PCC elections coming up in May, we will have a local election candidate meetup. Starts at 8:30 because we know you'll all be on the doorsteps till then, coming up on the 22nd of April. So really keen to support candidates standing at any level. Kelly, did you have and a massive thank you to Kiran and to Nan. I find you two are the most engaging women in the Labour movement to listen to, and I really could listen to you for hours. And the fact that you're all still here suggests that I am not alone in that endeavour. But thank you all very, very much for coming tonight, and have a fabulous International Women's Day and a reaffirming Women's History Month. And should anything more exciting happen this month, the very best of luck in your own areas in any general election we might find ourselves in. Or not. But we will be here to support you throughout, and have a good night.
Good night.